Thank you all for coming. I'm Joseph Capizzi, the Executive Director of the Institute for Human Ecology here at the Catholic University of America. We're really excited to finish out the school year, to ring in Advent to some extent with this excellent panel that's been put together by a very, very good friend of ours, Ross Douthat. As you know, here at the Institute for Human Ecology, what we strive to do is study and advance the conditions that conduce to human flourishing from the perspective of the Catholic Church. Ross has been a partner of ours now for more than a few years, and he was one of the first people that we added to our community, and we're just deeply grateful that he continues to take the time to come down and visit us from his home up in Connecticut, and then also to put together a wonderful panel like he has for us tonight. The topic, of course, is extremely timely. I think these are the right people to discuss it, despite what some of them might think. So I'll just turn everything over to Russ, and he'll introduce us, introduce the panelists. Then we'll have the conversation. We'll have Q&A as always, and then a little reception after. So thank you, Ross.
No, yes, there it is. Thank you all so much for being here on this frigid, but not quite as frigid as in my beautiful home of Connecticut night. We are going to talk tonight about Catholicism and nationalism, the both important forces in our world today, which is, how you would answer a term paper where you didn't have anything to say. You would say these are both important forces in our world today, and just end there. But we won't end there. We will go further, and we might even talk about things other than Catholicism in the course of this conversation. I have threatened the panelists with a question about American Protestantism and nationalism, so we'll see if they're ready for that kind of swerve, but I have every confidence in them. I'm joined, moving from extreme right to extreme left, of course, here by, sorry. Polar, right, usually when I'm not a moderator and I'm on a panel at some, respectable liberal institution, there's always a joke about whether I should be seated on the right or the extreme right and so on. So I have to take the opportunity to, crack a few of those jokes here. But anyway, from right to left, Michael Brendan Dougherty of National Review, Bradley Lewis of the Catholic University of America, and the institute that hosts us, Rusty Reno, the editor of First Things magazine, and Jennifer Frey of the University of South Carolina, and also a fellow at the institute. So fellows of the institute outnumber non-fellows at the institute on this panel. We'll see if that comes into play. But I'm just gonna start with a very sort of big picture question. Let the panelists have at it, each in turn, and then we will try, with my brilliant stewardship, to have a fairly freewheeling conversation, and then we'll turn it over to all of you for questions and have you out into the cold before it gets too cold. So I think the easiest place to start is just to talk about the somewhat fraught relationship, the somewhat historically fraught relationship between the two subjects of our panel tonight. If you go back certainly to 19th century Europe and the history of the Catholic Church's relationship to nationalist movements in that era, you would say that there's kind of a fundamental tension between Catholicism and national identity, Catholicism and nationalist movements, and that nationalism as a force in European politics was often associated with secularization, assaults on the privileges of the church, and so on. And if you were going to generalize even further beyond that, you would say that Catholicism as an institution at some level is fundamentally most comfortable with political institutions that are similar to itself, insofar as they have transnational, or dare one say, imperial aspirations. And so in that sense, Catholicism is always looking for the successor to the Holy Roman Empire, with which it can, have a sort of productive dialogue or an unproductive argument between pope and emperor, and thus the church has a sort of natural affinity for projects like, for instance, the European Union, that it doesn't necessarily have for nationalist projects. So that's one story you can tell. But then it obviously was more complicated than that, even in the 19th century, as Michael, who wrote a famous and brilliant book about his own Irish patrimony, can certainly tell you. The Irish example alone complicates the story. But in the present day, if you just looked around the Western world, North America and Europe, in terms of actual political engagement, you tend to find a pretty close alignment between many Catholic politicians, and especially sort of self-consciously conservative Catholic politicians, and sort of the various emergent nationalisms that we see in Eastern Europe, in France, in Italy, and to some extent even here in the somewhat more Protestant United States. So that sort of presents us with a kind of tension between that sort of historical assumptions about the church's relationship to nationalism and on-the-ground political realities today. So, for everyone, but starting with Michael, what should we make of that tension? What is the proper relationship between Catholicism and nationalism, and why are we in the place where we are today?
I'll start with the last one first. God's providence. Moving on to the other.
Also a good way to end term papers when you don't.
Moving on to the others. You're right. It would depend on which nationalism to have a relationship with. All right. I mean, is Catholicism compatible with nationalism? You were exactly right. If we were to boil it down to something that simple, I would point to a map where Poland is. I would do an elegant spin move around Germany to avoid that, stop at Belgium, and then I would slam dunk it with the preamble of the Irish Constitution. The reality is that nationalism is not one thing. Nationalists tend to be preoccupied with certain political topics or questions: sovereignty, language, borders, territorial acquisition, war, cohesion of a people, or building of a nation state, independence, political or otherwise. But nationalism is Protean. It adopts other ideologies opportunistically. So as empires are breaking up in the 20th century, nationalism could embrace communism in order to seek a sponsor that would deliver arms and help them break away from the British Empire in one case, or they might seek, nationalists in Hong Kong might seek sponsorship from the United States by being hyper-capitalist. Nationalism presents itself in this variety of guises because nationalism is an eruptive force in modern politics. The thing about nationalist movements is that they come and they go in the light of the challenges of the day. Where they tend to remain is where the sense of national loyalty is disturbed in some dramatic way. So in Western Ukraine, loyalty to the Ukrainian national project is under constant threat from the political power and influence, and now the military might of the Russian Federation. So you get a lot of nationalism in Western Ukraine. You get a lot of nationalism in Northern Ireland, where there's dueling allegiances sit next to each other uncomfortably, allegiances to the Irish Republic or to the United Kingdom, where conditions are more favorable for a country's life to flourish. You see nationalism fade away. When there's peace, prosperity, there's no major territorial disputes, nationalism kind of fades away. It's not in season. Most of us grew up in the United States at a time when the Cold War was over, and it felt like we were entering a real post-nationalist phase. The reason I think we are where we are right now, where a lot of conservative Catholics are looking to nationalism, is because international bodies like the EU seem to set themselves up almost deliberately as enemies of the church's cause. I mean, the EU deliberately left out Christianity as a basis for European civilization in its documents, referring only to its Roman inheritance and pagan inheritance. And these international bodies have been the vehicle for a rights revolution that the church has generally opposed, whether it's abortion rights or the rights to same-sex marriage or now trans rights. So conservative Catholics have been rallying to the idea of national parliaments as the seat of true political authority and sovereign authority for democratic peoples to make laws governing themselves. And that's been the kind of core resistance. That's also been the means of resistance toward not just for the redefinition of laws that touch on Christian social life, but of course it was also why nativists would go to national parliaments to impose immigration restrictions that would dissolve if they were just left in the hands of international human rights tribunals. So I think that's why we are where we are now. It could change in the future where these large international bodies like the UN or the European Union, suddenly remember Jacques Maritain's name fondly and start whispering into the church's ear again. I don't expect that'll happen anytime soon, though.
Yeah, so is this working? Yes, good. I think all of that makes a lot of sense. And so I just want to say two things to start with. One is to reinforce the point about the Protean character of nationalism. I mean, often it's just not clear even what people mean when they talk about it. So in one sense, nationalism it's really a kind of social science term, and it can mean a lot of different things. It can mean a certain kind of political reaction. It can mean the cause that certain national groups have to have their own state, ones that don't have their own state. There are all kinds of social science theories about what nationalism is. Is it something that's always there? Is it something that's specifically modern? Does it have to do with capitalism? Does it have to do with the construction of modern identities? Is it an ideological reaction to other kinds of social forces? And so that's a kind of abstraction that political scientists and sociologists talk about, and that's often mixed into discussions of actual political forces. So the leaders of political parties or journalists or people talking about things that are going on. And it's important, I think, to kind of disentangle those two things, because often when we're talking about real political events like national parliaments trying to claim sovereignty against international organizations or aspects of international law, the global economy, things like that, what you're really talking about is the desire for democratic accountability, which only exists at the level of nation states. I mean, there isn't any democratic accountability at the international level in regions of the world or something like that. So if people, political parties, politicians, ordinary citizens, civil society groups are to have any real say over policy, they have to have it through the democratic political institutions that exist in their countries, and so those institutions have to be vital. And so the tension there is really about that, I think. The tension with Catholic things, on the other hand, is not unique to nationalism, and it's absolutely permanent, and you can't ever get rid of it. And you would find the same tension with any other social group apart from the church, which is by definition a universal phenomenon. There isn't anything more universal than Jesus Christ. There isn't anything more universal than the gospel. There isn't anything on earth more universal than the Catholic Church. Universality built into that, and everything else is particular in some way. The family, right? And the same kind of tensions that exist between the Catholic Church and Christianity as a doctrine and political life exist relative to families too. Family's a natural institution, but the tensions between the gospel and the family are already in the New Testament. So any of these natural institutions have a kind of particularity that's always going to be in some kind of tension with Christianity. Now, those tensions are typically managed in some way, and the same is true with nationalism, I think. And the thinker in whom I think you look to where you can see that is really John Paul II. You can find the universal aspects of Christianity there and in all of his teaching, and especially in the last book that he wrote shortly before his death, Memory and Identity. There's quite a moving discussion of the nation, and you really see him as a kind of patriotic Pole, and that clearly had a great impact on him. So side by side with the universality that's part of Christianity is this kind of national identity that he kept and nurtured all of his life.
I'd like to underline not just the Protean character of nationalism, which is certainly the case, but the Protean character of the Catholic political imagination. The church has no, the church prefers no political form. It's compatible with tribal governance, it's compatible with monarchies, it's compatible with empires, democracies, and so on. So I think it's important to recognize that although it's certainly the case that bureaucrats and the Vatican like to talk to bureaucrats in Brussels because like seeks like, that's nothing intrinsic about the theological DNA of Catholicism, that it would prefer a multinational bureaucracy over national forms of governance. And we see this in De Valere in Ireland was a Catholic nationalist, certainly as Cardinal Archbishop of Krakow. Karl Wojtyła was a Polish nationalist. At the same time, the Habsburgs were Catholic imperial. I mean, they were Catholic imperial figures. So I just think that's important. Now, to realize, and also to underline Michael's point about nationalism being a response typically to pressures. It's a typically a project of recovery or restoration or reconciliation. And the appeal of nationalism in the present is a function of the 30-year project of globalization. And so I think people in various countries around the world feel like the pendulum swung too far in the direction of a global commercial empire, an American-led global commercial empire. And there's a felt need to recover and reconsolidate the national project so that we actually serve the good of all of the citizens of our country rather than those who are able to participate in the global economy. It's interesting that I think this is actually both parties in the United States right now are tilting in the nationalist direction. The Wall Street Journal editorial page derided the fact that the Blinken State Department had among its 7 priorities for our foreign policy middle-class flourishing, by which they did not mean the flourishing of middle class in China, or for even in that matter in Germany, but rather in the United States. And so to list that as one of the 7 goals of American foreign policy is to actually take a nationalist stance. We have to think of our foreign policy in terms of how it helps the median American flourish. So to my mind, nationalism, it has many faces, it can become a fright word, but that in my thinking, nationalism is a priority-setting word, that in the present circumstances, we should give priority to the need to regroup, reconsolidate, and recapture our national unity and sovereignty.
this working? Yeah, okay. It's I mean, Noah's really talked yet about Christian nationalism, which is sort of what I was focused on when I was trying to prepare for this. And when I think about, I mean, look, one thing that I want to acknowledge right away is that I understand perfectly well why nationalism is appealing to people now. I mean, I lived through the evacuation of the manufacturing in this country in a very personal way. And I understand very well the grievances of those communities because they were mine. And but I just don't think that nationalism or Christian nationalism seems to provide any solutions to the problems that those communities are facing. I think that the people in those communities tend to get typecast in weird ways. And I'm very interested in the ways that global capitalism has damaged the middle class in this country, and I recognize the need to address that. And I see so much of national conservatism as trying to be the place where those solutions get worked out. But when I look at what's going on at those conferences and the statement of principles that are put out by the national conservatives, I don't see really meaningful solutions to those problems. Now, when it comes to the relationship between national conservatism and Catholicism, I suppose I want to say a couple of things. Catholic social teaching does not seem to favor nationalism, but seems to somewhat explicitly teach against it, right? So one of the encyclicals that I was rereading to prepare for this was Pacem in Terris, right? Where, the Pope is very explicit that the good of nations ultimately need to be ordered, right, to something higher, a higher common good. And that people cannot be sort of just bounded up within national borders without losing something of vital importance from the Catholic perspective. I don't think that Catholic national conservatives take that seriously enough, especially if you look at the statement of principles that was put out, where it looks to me as if nations just get to decide what they want to do for themselves, full stop. And that would, for many reasons, I think, be worrying, but also out of joint with Catholic social teaching. So, I mean, from my perspective, it's kind of like, one, it doesn't seem to jive so well with Catholic social teaching, but even if it did, why are we having this conversation? I mean, sort of like what meaningful solutions, right, is it putting on the table, especially when it comes to Christian nationalism? So again, to go back to the statement of principles, there were a couple of statements about education, which were pretty worrying to me, that the goal of education is to serve the national interest. I don't believe that's the goal of education. The goal of education is human flourishing, full stop. And I also don't appreciate, obviously, as a professor within the national conservative movement, the very explicit animosity towards our universities and our professors as, quote, the enemy.
So I want to talk about sort of particular questions of America and nationalism, which I think goes to the questions you were raising about Christian nationalism, which tends to be more an American than a European term. But first, if I could just follow Jennifer's thread back to Rusty, but also anyone else, what do we think about this question? Rusty, you said Catholicism is indifferent to sort of national versus, as indifferent to national versus supranational governance as it is potentially indifferent to monarchy versus republic, and so on. There is, I think, pretty clearly some line of Catholic social teaching in the modern era, running from the popes of the 1960s down to some statements by Benedict XVI, that seems to be more on Jennifer's side. That says the church imagines a kind of, at the very least, imagines a supranational political destiny for the world, or an ideal. Do you think that's real or overstated? What do you make of that sort of
I think
threat?
that's certainly the case, and I think it's born out of the Cold War. Pachamateras's, the threat of nuclear holocaust hanging over the world, and then the hope that empowering some kind of transnational institutions would then secure a lasting peace and diffuse these conflicts. But this was to my mind, these are questions of discernment, reading the signs of the times. In point of fact, international institutions had almost no role to play in the prevention of nuclear war, but rather the strategy of deterrence seems to have succeeded, which is a strategy that can only be pursued by sovereign nations. And so I think, the church was misjudged the implications of the very correct concern it had about global affairs. Today we face, global warming and these sorts of things, and to my mind, which is an important question, but it's a question of utility, not a question of a spiritual good. Self-governance strikes me as a spiritual good, that it's integral to human flourishing, that we be engaged in the process of self-governance, both of ourselves as persons, but also of our community, in some way that we're involved. And if I have to sacrifice that spiritual good to secure, a 1 degree decline in global temperature, I'm willing to accept the 1 degree rise in global temperature. So again, I think, we have to, and here I think the popes have been, reading the signs of the times in a way that reflects their background in both World War II, in the case of Wojtyła and Ratzinger, and then, of course, in the very fraught Cold War period, when the standoff between the two superpowers. But that for the last 30 years, the greatest threat to human flourishing has been a global commercial empire that will, if unchecked, will lead to a kind of oligarchic control of human affairs. And I'm sorry, but the United Nations, and for that matter Brussels, is not likely to be able to muster the political might or energy to counteract the global billionaires, but it will rather be sovereign nations that do so.
I wanted to pick up on Professor Frey's accusations against the NatCon statement of principles.
Just why don't we describe what for?
I mean,
let's
I can't recite them by heart.
Let's make two stipulations for the context of this conversation. First, there is a intellectual / political movement in the United States called national conservatism that aspires to be the sort of manifestation of nationalist tendencies in American politics. Second, it put out a statement of principles. That's a sort of subordinate clause.
Yeah, and I think the mistake that there was a counter statement that you signed, and
we have your signature.
And the mistake that statement made, and I think that was repeated here, was that the national conservatives acknowledged no other good except solely defined by the criterion of national interest or by the nation itself, which is not true of the statement, which is basically an accusation of heresy against all its signatories, and an unfounded one, and it was just simply not true. It doesn't. Seeking the good of the nation does not necessarily mean with no reference to some outside standard like the faith or the virtues, including the virtue of moderation, and even objecting to the idea that the national interest should be observed in education, I think is almost strange. It's like saying the common good should not be observed in education, because it assumes that the national interest is somehow anti-human flourishing. And I don't know that that is true. I mean, that would have to be proven to be true in some way.
Should I? Yeah, okay. Yeah, so, I mean, the statement of principles is obviously very general, but I will definitely push back against the idea that the goal or purpose of education, whether we're talking about primary, secondary, or higher education, is to serve the national interest, right? In part because what the national interest is gets defined variously, and sometimes what is supposedly in the national interest, I think, is manifestly out of joint with the norms or the demands of virtue and human flourishing. But if you have set up the education system such that its primary function and goal is to serve this thing, the national interest, right? Then I think that you've yoked education to something sort of utilitarian or instrumental or outside of itself. Now, obviously, education is something fundamental to any civilization, right? But the goal of education is the formation of a human person, such that they can be free and flourish. And of course, every nation will take an interest in that. But there's also in that statement that the public schools...
Does the nation benefit from free and flourishing citizens?
Sure. But I mean, right, but where's your ordering there?
That's my restating my objection. My objection is, of course, if you just say the national interest is whatever a politician defines it as in...
But practically speaking,
vainly.
That's the case. I mean, practically speaking, in a functional democracy, that will be the case.
Oh, okay. Well, I thought we were like talking as intellectuals and thinkers and scholars, where you can refer to something like the common good or the national interest and mean something other than like a party program.
What if the national interest is, suppose, take it up a level of abstraction, but say, presumably the American national interest at some point is opposed to the national interest of Mexico, right? Like that is certainly potentially a possibility, right? That's sort of indeed inherent.
Almost a certainty.
Almost. Well, is it almost a certainty?
Oh, I think it's almost a certainty that in
Okay.
some respect our interest as a nation is divergent from that of Mexico.
Okay, but then in that sense, then it seems like we are, if American citizens are being educated for the purpose of serving the interest of the American society at the expense of the interests of Mexican society, and here I'll leap 2 steps ahead in what I wanted to talk about and note that Mexico is a much more Catholic country than the United States, then how much of an interest should American Catholics have in such a project?
Well, that was like saying that, my family, is not very Catholic, and the people down the street are very pious and Catholic, therefore I ought not to be concerned about the interests of my family, but rather the family down the street.
But you just said I think if the interests of your family are actually in deep conflict with the interest of the family down the
I don't
street.
say deep conflict. I don't think we're in deep conflict.
Mild conflict.
But I think that Mexico, they benefit from remittances of people working in the United States. They do not have a strong interest in limiting illegal immigration to the United States. I don't blame the Mexican government for not having a strong interest in limiting that immigration. In fact, I think they have an interest in passing people through who come from Central America. We do not have an interest in allowing that to happen. And so we have tensions, and our government negotiates with their government, and we may say the Biden administration does a bad job at it. Fine, but I actually think in good faith they're trying to represent our interests in Mexico City.
But isn't there a real dilemma? I mean, I'm not suggesting a resolution to this dilemma, but it seems to me that from a Catholic perspective, that sort of crystallizes the dilemma, right? You have your brothers and sisters in Christ who want to work for wages that employers in the United States are willing to pay, but it is not in some version of the American national interest for those brothers and sisters in Christ to be so employed.
I just I don't see because I say it works out in our families all the time, where, I pay my college tuition for my kids, even though that money could probably be better used by another family of much lesser means than my own. But I prefer my children, and I prefer them rightly. I should not prefer them unjustly. I should not do injustices such that my children flourish. But I would say I'm a bad parent indeed if I don't prefer my children to my neighbor's children, no matter how pious that family is. And conversely, I should prefer my fellow citizens to the citizens of Mexico. Not to permit injustices to be done to the citizens of Mexico, not to wish them ill at all, but rather this is just a straightforward, I think, moral duty that we have to those with whom we share a common citizenship.
I want to clarify, when I say national interest, I am a Catholic, right? So I do believe ultimately God is sovereign over nations and men. And so I believe something, I wouldn't want to say this totally mechanistically, but if a politician said, we're going to define the American interest as enslaving everyone in Saskatchewan, that is not in actual national interest, and actually it's kind of the sort of
taking names of everyone
that is
on behalf of my wife's Canadian ancestors.
When I say the national interest, I do not mean that kind of a project. I believe, precisely because I'm a Catholic, that is the sort of thing that will excite God's wrath on our country and work to our destruction, just as I believe unjust wars do of all sorts. So that's all I mean by I didn't understand necessarily the objection to the national interest in education, because I see that the nation does have an interest in my own children's education. Their basic allegiance to the country is part of their education. The attachment of their sentiments to it through learning our country's history, its songs, its legends, its mythology, and of course the bad parts of its history too. That is in the nation's interest, and I don't find that to be contaminative of the common good or human flourishing at all. It flows out from it. So yeah, I mean, ultimately, what I'm arguing for is that nationalism. There are of course ultra-nationalists. I can think of some of the earliest French writers, and of course, the hysterical Germans, for whom the idea is like racial supremacy, superiority, to us everything, to the rest nothing. That's obviously a form of nationalism that Catholicism will reject with every fiber it has.
Brad, can I bring you in on anything you want to be brought
Well,
in?
I think it's important to talk about what we mean by national interest. The national interest is it the interest of the Institutional Revolutionary Party in Mexico City, or is it the interest of whatever AMLO's political party is called now? Is it, when we're talking about the national interest of Russia, is it the national interest of Vladimir Putin and the 25 oligarchs who support him? is the interest of the Chinese people, the Chinese Communist Party. I mean, it seems to me it would be very much consistent with the United States' genuine national interest that Mexico had a flourishing economy that functioned properly and that was able to support its citizens in such a way that you wouldn't have massive immigration over the border. And it's not because, the Mexican people somehow want to have the economic political system that they have. They have a political system with a lot of problems in some ways, and it seems to me, again, just in geopolitics, there are two countries that are more important to the United States than any other ones, Canada and Mexico. And I think it's in our
We've
interest.
threatened one with enslavement
I
tonight
know.
and promised to cut off remittances to the other, so we're doing
have
well.
changed. But it's in our interest for those countries to be really well off. And politicians and the passions that they regularly exploit for their own purposes are not the same thing as national interest. And often nationalism gets swept up into that.
Can I push you just, since we've had a few analogies, and you made one as well, between sort of Catholicism's complex relationship to the nation and its sometimes complex relationship to the family and familial loyalties. Do you think that family and nation are good analogs for one another? Anyone can answer this, but I'm going to Brad.
I think, look, Jesus warns us that we may have to hate our mother and our father, our brother and our sister to follow him. So clearly the family, a natural good, is trumped by the supernatural good of our fellowship with God in Christ. And the same is obviously true of the nation. And Michael gave the good example. If there are pernicious, wicked policies being promoted by those who purport to stand for the interests of the nation, then of course we have to resist them, even to the point of unpatriotic acts of disobedience. But in the normal course of human affairs, the church recognizes that the natural family is integral to human flourishing. And we also recognize that it can be Christian. We talk about the Christian family. We talk about Christianizing the family, bringing the family life into a Christian frame of reference. And I think the same is true of the nation. Now, we live in a very big, giant, diverse nation. Is it prudent, wise, possible to embark on a project of a Christian, of trying to reconstruct a Christian nation which maybe didn't even exist 100 years ago, but whatever, even if we admit it? Maybe not. In fact, I'm skeptical of that project. But I think it's theoretically incorrect to say that a nation cannot be Christian and there cannot be a Christian nation, just as I think it's obviously incorrect to say that there cannot be a Christian family.
Sorry, who's arguing that there cannot be a Christian nation?
Oh, there are definitely people out there who argue that.
I mean, shall I argue it just for the, I mean, I think it's, I think the more reasonable question is about, well, first, should we consider the nation and the family as analogs, right? Stipulating that, as you did, right, that Christianity, Catholic Christianity, calls us sometimes to abandon or, in some sense, betray our families, and may call us in some moments to abandon and betray our nations. It's obviously like the obligations that I have to my children, it seems to me, are much more obvious and self-evident, and therefore the burden of proof on the person standing in persona Christi and saying you must break those obligations for the sake of Christ. That's a high bar to clear. My obligations to fellow citizens of a nation state, people who I do not personally know, seem at the very least to be more attenuated, right, than my obligations to my family members. It seems less immediately clear that you must prefer, someone in Illinois over someone in Mexico in the same way that you naturally prefer your son to the son of your neighbor down the street. I guess that's what I was sort of trying to push at with the question about the family nation analogy, that critics of nationalism could concede sort of that, yeah, there's a high bar for when you're supposed to hate your mother and father. Sometimes you are, but it's a high bar. But it's maybe a slightly lower bar for when you're supposed to sort of think about the interests of the universal human race over the interests of your fellow citizens. And then there's also the related question of, is the United States a nation state?
Well, let's
Right.
go back to family and
Yeah.
nation.
Okay.
St. Thomas ranks the duty to nation higher than duty to family. And we know
That's a
that
good
in
rejoinder.
times of war, when there's conscription, the mother and the father have to give the son over to the purposes of national defense. So it's a kind of a hating of your child for the sake of the larger community. So I just want to get that out there.
that is
So
a
in
good-
other words, we
that's-
should, clearly the question of emotional attachment, that's obvious. The family is far more fundamental. But I think the moral logic of the matter doesn't follow exactly the emotional logic of the matter.
Yeah, okay, all right, good. Then we've resolved that question. Nation before family, right? Do you agree? I'm trying to resolve some
St. Thomas
questions.
famously had a strained relationship with his family.
So then let's push on with that excellent rejoinder to the rejoinder to the questions about America itself, right? So we started out with Michael's wonderful leapfrogging, right, from, Poland to Belgium to Ireland, a series of, if not small, at least embattled and persecuted peoples constantly in danger of having their language, their patrimony, their history, wiped out by some conquering or oppressive power. And I think if we're talking about sort of the range of nationalisms, we can probably everyone on the panel would be in favor of some form of Irish nationalism in the late 19th century and against some form of German nationalism in the 1930s. But God willing, we aren't in either of those positions in either Europe right now, but especially the United States, right? So, I guess I'll go to you, Michael, first of all, so the complaint, the origin, the anxious origin of American nationalism right now is not a threat of foreign invasion, right? It's not a threat, or
Have you looked at primetime Fox lately?
right. So what is the threat to the American nation right now? Rightly understood.
So Rusty is generally right that the vogue for nationalism in the last 10 years especially, whether it's Brexit or Viktor Orban or Donald Trump, is driven by various reactions to the kind of post-Cold War period of globalization. So the United States faces just a few things. One is mass uncontrolled immigration, which whether you're cheering the long-term trend demographically or not, just big demographic change just tends to unsettle people's sense of shared loyalties, and particularly when it involves, questions like illegal immigration, where there's a sense of unfairness or unjustness or a dumbing down of the value of citizenship. The second thing for the United States in particular would be a sense of growing threat from China's rise as potentially a rival power, and then the ongoing anger or resentment about the forgotten man theme in the Trump campaign, the deindustrialization of the Midwest, the crisis facing prime-age working men in the United States who are continually dropping out of the workforce. These are, on the scale of historical events, relatively small irritants to our sense of national place and national loyalty. And that is why American nationalism has been expressing itself in the kind of mild, peaceful form it has been, which is people voting at a ballot box or organizing conferences and giving speeches. That is perfectly legitimate. This isn't,
Occasionally some other things too.
well, yes, on the edges, but this is not. This movement has been in the United States and Europe overwhelmingly just a democratic movement, abiding by democratic norms. That's very different from the 1930s, where the issues at stake were things like the enslavement of the Polish people and the annihilation of the Jews, and which excited people to engage in mass street violence against communists or foreign subversives. That is a much nastier rash of nationalism. So, yeah, where was I?
Well, I would add to the forgotten man, I want to make it more precise. The David Goodhart distinction between somewhere people and anywhere people, I think, is a useful heuristic. And you know, the globalization and the vast wealth that has created and opportunities has dramatically expanded the class of the anywhere people. And so part of the divide in our country is a cultural divide between the top 10% and maybe the next 20% who are the supporting class for the top 10% and everybody else. And so there's a growing anxiety among voters, and I share their anxiety, that many of the most powerful people running the country do not have their interests at heart because their interests diverge. If I'm a Hollywood producer, I have a lot more interest in making the CCP happy than serving, than supporting whatever the moral and social norms necessary for middle-class Americans to have a decent life. Or if I'm a Wall Street, CEO of a big Wall Street bank, we know that the same problem. We know that the NBA is very keen to criticize our society as systemically racist, but very eager not to say anything untoward about the Uyghurs or anything else going on in China. And so this is unsettling, it seems to me. And it suggests a problem. And I agree with Michael.
Right.
It's not a crisis. We're not, we're not. But it suggests that these are a problem that responsible statesmen, responsible citizens would want to address and repair that connection and the civic bond between the leaders and the led.
And the one point I wanted to lead up to, which is actually to make a kind of concession, which is that nationalism is this eruptive force of modern politics, and that is why it frightens people, because if you do not share in the sense of being unsettled, if you do not share in the resentments or aspirations of the nationalists, the overwhelming character of nationalist movements and why they are so alarming to satisfied conservatives or progressives is this angry, emotive character, the fact that nationalist movements teem with powerful feelings about treason or resentment. That is true of nationalist movements, and it has always been true, because it is nationalist movements are built upon this kind of volcanic material, the deepest sense of people's loyalties, right? That, in fact, your allegiance to your country does in some way, as we said, it means that your feelings about your country are tied up with your feelings about your children, or what you would send them to die for, what kind of society you're sending them out to live in. So yeah, of course, like conservatives who want who kind of focus on our deep appreciation for what's been handed on to us, and if you feel satisfied with the society that has been handed on to you as it is, all these angry nationalists are going to seem like a threat. So too with liberals who think that all politics should just be cool-headed deliberation about policy, the deep well of emotion that nationalists bring to politics will be frightening.
Well, sorry, can I ask just a follow-up question?
Sure.
I mean, so it seems like the criticisms that you're making or the worries that you're bringing out are criticisms of capitalism, right? So what are the interests of, you know, Apple Corporation or Hollywood producers, right? It's to maximize a profit, and so they want to appease the Communist Party rather than worry about, I mean, and you can run that sort of argument for any international corporation, right? Which may or may not have its headquarters in the US, but it doesn't really matter, right? Because we're just talking about global capital. So I just have a follow-up question about how nationalism addresses that problem, which is a problem of political economy that's global. And then, you know, secondly, I guess I don't understand this talk about repairing the civic bond with respect to nationalism, because I mean, nationalism is indelibly caught up with Trumpism, and when I think about Trumpism, I don't think about repairing the civic bond, right? Like, that wasn't what that movement was about. And again, just to go back to the national conservative movement, what you had coming out of that movement very explicitly were very explicit arguments that civility, right, is a, you know, we can't have that, right? We've been hoodwinked into thinking we need civility and civic bonds of friendship. What we need is power.
Yeah. I want to dispute this Trump point. I think, on the contrary, the Trump phenomenon was helpful. It was a wake-up call. The Inflation Reduction Act, you know, it's $400 billion or $600 billion. I can't remember what, but more than 100 billion, maybe 200 billion, are tax credits for electric vehicles contingent upon their content being made in America. So this would not have happened before 2016. And this is, the people who are running our country have gotten a message. And the message is, we effed up with globalization, and we need to correct course. And we need to do what it takes to provide decent paying jobs for high school educated Americans. Otherwise, they won't trust us. And you know, you can you know, the Wall Street Journal editorial page roundly attacking these things. That's social engineering. The Europeans are angry. They brought a case before the WTO challenging this legislation as a violation of the free trade agreements that we entered into in the 1990s. Let's leave that to the side, all fine. But I think it's just a testimony to the fact that, that you know, whatever the, you know, one can have endless misgivings about Trump the man, but the phenomenon was a healthy wake-up call to our ruling class. And to their credit, I'm not a Democrat. I don't like many aspects of the Inflation Reduction, but they're right in doing what they did to really use a lot of money to try to force manufacturing back in the United States. And they will succeed. We've got a $100 billion chip plant being built outside of Columbus, Ohio, underwritten by government guaranteed loans. So there is a big, we're going to spend trillions of dollars over the next decade in order to both indemnify ourselves against our vulnerability to China in manufacturing, and also to deal with the social problem that reached crisis proportions in the last decade.
But is that?
And that's nationalism, folks.
It is, but interested, but then to follow up Jennifer's capitalism question, right? So I think that's a strong answer to her question, if you are a global superpower, right? If you're a global superpower, you can use nationalism as a weapon against the excesses of international finance, corporations that just want to export jobs to China and so on. But that is sort of isn't that kind of an imperial solution? Can't the US only do that because we're really not a nation, we're really an empire? What can Poland do? What can Ireland do? What can Hungary do? That is the equivalent.
The Germans pursued a very effective mercantilist policy for the last 30 years. and they avoided a lot of the social problems that we created in our society. They have other problems of their own, don't get me wrong. But to your point about Hungary or Poland or Ireland, or I was in Chile recently, it's tough to be a small country.
Well, and
You have less power, you have less resources at your disposal.
unless you join together
No,
in
you
some
literally-
sort of internationalist, right?
But
I
that's the thing. But the thing is that nationalists have, and this is one thing that again bothers people about nationalists, is nationalist movements often work together and have from the beginning. I mean, people were annoyed that Eamon de Valera met with Indian nationalists and others seeking to escape the British Empire. And people get annoyed when the Polish and Hungarian governments work together. And to answer your question, what can they do? They can withhold, when they have a structure in the EU where one veto vote out of 27 can scuttle a project. Hungary can vote against a sanctions package against Russia until it gets more favorable terms on energy loans, which it needs because its energy infrastructure is left over from the Cold War and overly dependent on Russia. So you do find ways where you can to be a nationalist even within the EU.
Can I put a good word in for supranational? I mean, the EU.
Yes.
The EU has shown itself to be much stronger in disciplining the big tech companies than the United States government has, and so I am not a nationalist ideologically. I mean, I'm in favor of sovereignty, but it strikes me that in most circumstances, the solidarity enjoyed in a coherent nation state gives the governments of that society the power the ability to stand up to very powerful forces in a capitalist economy. And again, the EU, maybe there's enough cultural unity and solidarity across that continent to sustain something like the EU and give it the kind of cultural, political legitimacy necessary to take these strong stances.
Last question, and then we'll open it up. In terms of what alarms people, but also Catholic critics and skeptics of nationalism, right? I feel like we haven't just come out and, except in the context of Germany in the 1930s, said the word racism, right? Which seems like a inherent temptation of nationalist form of politics at some level, to some degree. And I guess the question, I think I'll put this to any of the more philo-nationalist panelists, so you can, but I think it's easy for defenders of nationalism to say, look, no nationalist regime at the moment is, in the position of Hitler's Germany, is likely to become Hitler's Germany. This is a red herring, and so on. I think that's fair. A different question, though, is sort of at the level of the psyche and the soul, right, where you do very clearly see people drawn to nationalist ideas in American conservatism who also end up drawn to what I think you can fairly call white nationalist or white nationalist adjacent ideas, right? And the example that we had, I'll bring in Protestantism here at the end, but Jennifer, you started by talking about Christian nationalism. The big Protestant book defending Christian nationalism, right, that came out in the last year, has the author of that book ran a podcast, and the co-host of his podcast turned out to have essentially an alt on Twitter, a very thinly disguised alt that was basically sort of dabbling in anti-Semitism and white nationalism and so on. I think it's one example, one case study, but I think you can't live in the worlds we all live in and not see versions of that temptation showing up. So I'm not exactly sure what the question is here beyond a sort of question about what are the obligations of people invested in nationalist politics to worry about that temptation, not sort of Hitlerism taking power, but our fellow Christians and Catholics being sort of drawn via nationalism into personal temptations towards racist ideologies.
Well, and I would expand it to include some of the things Jennifer, I think, rightly named about the Trump movement, and about some national conservatives who say, oh, civility is worthless or a game. I agree with your critique to a large degree. I do think some political challenge to the status quo will always be seen as intemperate and rude, but you don't have to make the charge true by actually acting like a boorish jerk, which unfortunately Donald Trump did at times. I mean, he said things that
From
were
time to time.
totally indefensible. No, I mean, but this is true. I mean, the temptation is perennial for nationalism. I mean, you again, the reason I like focusing on nationalism as almost a project-based, ad hoc, and opportunistic ideology is that it is. And each project that nationalism takes on, you have to ask whether it is good in itself and whether the means proposed to achieve it are good. Is establishing an independent Polish nation state a good thing? Yes. Did the Poles who did it immediately turn around and wage an aggressive war of land acquisition that oppressed people who didn't deserve it? Yes, they did. Did some of those Polish nationalists start getting excited about Zionism precisely because they hated their Jewish neighbors and wanted to expel them from Poland? Yes, they did, and they need to be condemned for it. And yes, nationalism, with its angry and choleric character, attracts angry and choleric people. As it's been a marginalized force, it also attracts marginal, choleric, angry people. So like literally the worst commenters on Reddit and so on come to define the character of nationalist politics in some way. So yeah, there's absolutely a troll problem, and that's why, thank God, you hope you have other values like the Catholic faith to order your love for your nation, as you need. I mean, you need, nationalism does not produce a hierarchy of goods and loves and tells you how to love them proportionately and well. It, in fact, has to be subject to an ethic that does so.
All right, we've forced our audience to listen to us talk for long enough. So are we doing a microphone, Joe, or are we?
Yes, yeah, we have people with microphones. So just raise your hands and somebody will come around with a microphone. Make your question a question, please.
Thanks for an excellent panel. I'm wondering, since we're talking about Catholicism and nationalism, whether any of you would like to comment on why it is that Pope Francis has, shall we say, been very slow to call out Russian nationalism, and the fact that today, as a result of Russian nationalism, you have a situation that's very that has so many of the elements that we saw in the rise and the behavior of Nazi Germany.
I think you're never going to get a pope who endorses a war, even, right, I mean, when it's fairly clear which side, it's an armed conflict, and I think, I totally agree with you. I'm just saying, I think what you're always going to get is a call for negotiations and peace, and I don't disagree at all with that characterization. You're totally right. I mean, but I want to say one other thing that's somewhat related to that, but I listened to this conversation, in a certain respect, I wonder if the term nationalism is useful at all. Because in one sense, what does nationalism mean? It means not globalism. It means not having a global control of things. And why would you want the one rather than the other? I mean, there's certain things that are global and there's certain things that are not. And it seems because you don't have any kind of genuine democratic accountability at the global level. The only place where voters and citizens can have an entry into the process is at the national level. And so if you think democracy is worth having, right, that's going to be in tension with globalism. Now, at the same time, nationalism means a desire for a kind of unity, perhaps against the forces of globalization, that the reason that we've been the effects and not the causes of our own destiny is because we're not unified and we need to be more unified. And that desire can lead to exploitation by politicians of racial animosities and resentments and terrible, terrible things, and can be used as a justification for war, and sometimes is. I mean, and in this case, I think it has been too. But fundamentally, I mean, I think the Pope has changed. I mean, he has said more about it recently. It's taken a while, but I think partly it's just, popes and high churchmen are going to talk about peace as much as they can.
Can I just jump in? I question the characterization of Russia and the relationship to nationalism. I mean, Putin has called nationalism a cancer and portrays this war itself as anti-nationalist because he heads a multinational federation. And Ukraine, engaged in a noble defense of its existence, is also engaged in classically and frankly oppressive nationalist cultural strategies of outlawing the publication of the Russian language unless you have an equivalent Ukrainian publication. This is a side of nationalist politics that's classic in the European sense, and it's bound up both with it's inseparable from Ukraine's desire to save itself from Russian influence. So I just don't know that we could just say the aggressive party is the nationalist party in that war.
Sir, that's not it. We're gonna, you could come up afterward. I just have to move on because I kept this. There's gonna be a very ironic aspect that I wanted to mention. All right, Mr. Carney, front row.
I was hoping we could talk a little more about Jesus, the Bible, and the Catechism. It seems that for reasons we've referred to, Jesus was really about dissolving previously existing bonds. And the church, the Catechism itself explicitly says society, the good of humanity requires society to be organized on a multinational global level. It's not just recent popes, it's in the Catechism, it's sort of pro-internationalism. On the other hand, the church has always talked about subsidiarity, not just as a way of sort of practically managing affairs, but as a natural thing in itself. So I guess that's what I'd like. I mean, I'm going to throw this one to Jennifer. What do you think is sort of the Catholic understanding of the natural role of the nation? And then if you want, you can compare it to the natural role of lower level organizations or global organizations.
Yeah, so I think it's difficult to talk about the nation, right? Because, right, I mean, just if you think about sort of the pagan conception or the ancient conception of the polis, right? Like, this is nothing like America, right? I mean, and sometimes people will very naively try to translate a kind of Aristotelian approach to politics and map it on to the U.S. And I have to be like, we're not a polis, right? I mean, we're way too big. And I think similarly, you know, if you think about what happened in Italy in the 19th century, right? I mean, the creation of the nation state of Italy was forced on independent communities, many of which didn't want it. And then, you know, you have the complete oppression of the South, which is why they all came to the U.S., right? Like 96% of Italian-American immigrants to the U.S. are from the Mezzogiorno, and that's for a reason, right? and Italians had to learn Italian by watching TV, which is namely the Florentine dialect. So I just think, like, what do we mean when we talk about a nation? Or, I mean, of course, when we think about Catholic social teaching, that is something that is in a modern context. And when we think about principles of subsidiarity and solidarity, all of that's incredibly important. I mean, the church has long recognized keeping local things local, right? And I think one of the things that I was really hoping that we would talk about, but didn't get around to it, is how, quite frankly, nationalism often works against the local in ways that are like really bad. And I could talk about that all day when it comes to education in particular, because that's my obsession, but like it manifests itself in many ways. At the same time that the church always has enforced, principles of subsidiarity and the kind of solidarity or civic friendship, right? The civic bonds that are necessary, that are frankly necessary for any kind of successful political unit. The church also recognizes that there is something higher, right? On the one hand, the church, the mystical body of Christ, but then also in Catholic social teaching, you have references to the broader political community. I mean, we haven't talked about Fratelli Tutti, but it's obvious that Francis is very much in the same tradition as John Paul II and Benedict XVI, in saying that, we have to have a politics that recognizes, the rights of migrants as making a claim on us, right? They are making a claim on us as Christians. And if we turn our back on them, right, then we are not living the gospel. And I absolutely agree that you have a preference for your family. That makes sense. But that is not a reason to not recognize the claim of the migrant on you. And again, I think we just have this tension where, many conservatives are legitimately worried about immigration. I don't favor open borders, right? You have to have some immigration policy. But I feel like many nationalist conservatives aren't worried enough about the fact that these immigrants belong in our churches. They are filling our churches. And again, they are making a claim on us. And it's not enough to just say, well, you're not one of us, or you didn't come here legally.
Sir.
My question is for Mr. Douthat. You asked earlier.
I'm just the moderator. I'll answer quickly.
Thank you. I appreciate it. You had asked a question about comparing us to Ireland in the 19th century. What's the danger here? Didn't you answer that question a week and a half ago in your op-ed about euthanasia in Canada? Isn't there a brave new world that's facing us, not just with this globalism and the capitalist aspect, but also in the religious spiritual aspect, and that only a democracy that has some strength can stand up to that kind of movement that we see taking over in Canada?
Yes, and I should say that one of your duties as moderator is to make sure that the discussion in the panel is perfectly balanced, and some of my sharp-elbowed questions for Rusty and Michael especially have been in that role. I have a great deal of sympathy for all of the points that they make about the reasons for contemporary nationalism and its potential virtues. I will say, though, that I'm less convinced that I think that conservatism, in what I said in that column and what I stand by, is that conservatism in America in particular, but generally conservatism throughout the West, remains essential even if you have objections or doubts about it, precisely because of that broad tendency, what seems like the broad tendency within liberalism right now to head in a sort of Aldous Huxley Brave New World direction. I'm not completely convinced that the best way to understand that threat is via the mediation of transnational institutions and elites. I'm a little bit of a skeptic, for instance, of sort of the Great Reset theory of, you know, sort of the idea that, well, we need to be particularly focused on sort of the collaboration of international elites and international corporations and so on. It seems to me that it seems like you can understand what's happening in Canada more by reference to a universal trend that takes particular forms in liberal society than through reference to a sort of globalist conspiracy to, I'm not saying you're saying conspiracy, but this is sort of where the argument tends to sort of impose euthanasia. Like euthanasia is happening in the Netherlands for Dutch reasons and in Canada for Canadian reasons, and those reasons are similar because all of these societies are participating in late modern liberal decadence. What, sorry? Right, but is that darkness a result of internationalism as opposed to nationalism? I'm not sure. I think nationalism as an expression of resistance to it is good, but I'm not sure it's the only possible expression. And as a Catholic, at its best, the Catholic Church is providing an international form of resistance that is supposed to set up, you know, a form of solidarity, an international culture war front, in a sense. So that would be my hesitation about sort of framing that challenge just in terms of nationalism versus globalism, I guess. Let's go, sir. And what time is it, Rusty? Okay, so we're gonna do 3 more questions. Is that, Joe, 3 more questions or 2? Sure, 2. 2? Okay, so.
How y'all doing? I would say that the greatest threat to the United States is progressivism, and it's become sort of just the state religion, and they evangelize through the means of media, entertainment, academia, K through 12, government, and so all sense of neutrality has been thrown out. Would you say that it is appropriate for government, public education, to then evangelize for Christianity, for Catholicism, or is that still kind of untouchable for when it comes to terms of like conservative principles, generally thinking that the state is a neutral or secular power? Or is it appropriate for the state to use its power to essentially teach a doctrine?
And if I can take your question and put a nationalist-related wrinkle on it, if the answer were yes, historically, when the American state taught on behalf of a religion, that religion was Protestantism and not Catholicism, right? So to what extent does that question complicate the original question for anyone who wants to take it?
It seems to me that we don't want the state to usurp the church's role in proclaiming the gospel. So certainly the state, we should, as Catholics, as Christians, reject the notion that the state functions as the pastor of its people. That said, strikes me as, you know, having biblical literacy as a requirement for some school systems to establish that as a requirement any more than literacy in some other important text in our tradition would seem like a wise policy to me. I think part of what young people suffer from is that in their education they get a relentless kind of technical reductionist education. They have very little encouragement to lift their eyes towards something that is transcendent. And so I think in our educational policies, we should as we can, prudently, within the localities in which we live, try to think of ways in order to introduce some invitation to transcendence into education. It could be a required class in philosophy for high school seniors. It could, as I say, be biblical literacy. It could be the moment of silence at the beginning of the school day. Different things are possible in different regions of the country, but I think we should be eager to explore those possibilities.
Can I just say,
Very quick.
very fast. I mean, so I just completely agree with almost everything that you just said, but I'm just curious because in the National Conservative Statement of Principles, it like explicitly says that public schools should be should teach Christianity when their populations are majority Christians. So do you disagree with that?
I do think that where if we reverse the school prayer cases from the early 1960s and school districts in North Dakota decide to open the school day with prayer, that we should welcome this as an outcome. That's not the same as that's not usurping the role of the church. There's many ways in which people are exposed to Christianity. So creating the conditions under which Christian faith is encouraged, I would welcome that. I think our country would be better off if more people were Christian. The people themselves would obviously be better off if they were Christian. I don't see any reason not to design curricula that create a congenial environment for the Christian faith. That's not the same as evangelizing.
All right, last one from this side of the room. Sir. Yes, but it's coming.
All right, thanks. I wanted to go back to the topic of racism relative to Christian nationalism in particular. So there's a global Black Lives Matter movement, and in the United States, huge pushback from Christian nationalists, in my observation. So to what extent is this evidence that the Christian nationalism in the U.S. is really just code for white nationalism?
I just reject the view that, Black Lives Matter speaks for African Americans in our society. It's perfectly possible to think something is a kind of false exaggeration of a situation in our country and harmful to the body politic, and that doesn't make one a white nationalist.
I'll just say I think a lot of people that embrace Black Lives Matter as a slogan do so because it was a very effective slogan, and a lot of Christian nationalists, who oppose it, are getting their political formation and education from conservative sources that point to the Black Lives Matter organization's own statement of principles, which had points about disrupting the nuclear family and achieving socialism in our times, things like this. And that's sort of, they're attacking it as a leftist movement, not as a black movement.
Yeah, well, I just want to say really quickly, I think that it would be very helpful. We started by talking about what a Protean concept nationalism is, but I think it would be really helpful for those who speak on behalf of nationalism to be more explicit and clear that they don't mean ethno-nationalism, right? That this isn't a nationalism tied to an ethnicity or a race, and then that Christian nationalism is not so tied. And one reason to be very worried is because, again, the only real book that we have making the case for Christian nationalism very explicitly says it is an ethno-nationalism.
No, he does not. No, he doesn't. He doesn't. In fact, he explicitly denies that.
Sorry, we should. This is Stephen.
Yes, he explicitly denies that cultural affinity is racial in nature.
It's ethnic.
Ethnos is we because our imaginations are formed in the reductive DNA approach to life. We insist that the word ethnic has to mean those with whom I share the same DNA, when I think Wolf is using it, ethnos, as a people united by a common culture and language, which
And blood.
He rejects the notion of blood, as explicitly rejects the notion of blood as any kind of marker of he rejects common descent as a condition for cultural unity in a nation. And I just think, why do I have to sign some pledge? Like, what evidence does anybody have that I am a white nationalist or a racist? Why do I have to sign some sort of document pledging that I'm not these things in order to be able to avoid the charge that I am these things? And so I refuse to play that game.
But I mean, we have to go. But in the case of do you think it's reasonable for Stephen Wolf? It's Stephen, right?
Yes.
Yes, is who's the author of a book about Christian nationalism that, at the very least, uses terms that some people might consider sort of racially charged, to issue a denunciation of Christian nationalism if it turns out that his close friend, to issue a denunciation of white nationalism if it turns out that his close friend and podcaster does appear to be some sort of white nationalist, right? I mean, no one's asking you to personally abjure white nationalism, but there is some temptation here, right? Do you think, right? I mean, there seems...
This guy that he did the podcast with, these alias Twitter account, had 50 followers.
But he did the podcast with him.
I don't know how many people download that podcast.
That's probably fair.
There are undoubtedly people in our society that hold rebarbative views about race. There's no question about that. We have 330 million people in this country. But I would submit Bronze Age pervert who for whom race plays no role, is a far greater influence on young conservative men than this guy actually.
Wait. All right. I can't believe we're ending here. This is a complete failure of me as a moderator. But did you just say that for Bronze Age pervert, who for those who don't know is a pseudonymous Twitter personality and internet personality and sort of Nietzschean vitalist, I think would be a fair way to describe his appeal, who has some undoubted appeal to younger conservatives, do you think that race plays no role in his writing?
Oh, the male-female difference plays a very significant role.
I didn't ask you about the male-female difference. I asked you, have you read Bronze Age Mindset? Because I have.
Well, I have not read extensively.
Okay, then we will leave it here with Rusty and I will reconvene at some future date with no audience to discuss
the rebarbative views of the Bronze Age.
Do you follow him on Twitter?
No.
Okay. Rusty and I will reconvene in private in some future date. And for the rest of you, please join me in thanking our panel, if not perhaps the moderator, for a delightful evening.